guys, for your excellent remarks. Realizing that I am the one who stands between you and a cold beverage, I will be relatively quick about this. But I think we really need to begin where we probably end where we should have began, and that is to thank the amazing staff here at the Atlantic Council for the fantastic work they've done. Specifically, Caroline, Matt, Kitch, Samantha, and Sylvia have done all of this, and we are all very grateful for all their work. So thank you so much, guys. Really. You have no idea how many emails have flown across. It is fantastic. So thanks again. Let me begin and just add a couple of comments that have kind of come to me throughout this process. And one thing I want to do is say a couple of words about this term Global South, which has been discussed so much, and where it comes from, right? So we all know that Mao Zedong created this idea of the third world, right? And the third world is a deeply political concept, okay? You have the first world, the hegemonic powers, the second world, which are the so-called running dogs of the first world, and then you have the third world, right, which China says it was part of. This concept then evolves into the developing world, which is a very economic concept, right? It's about emerging economically. The Global South actually brings both of these together. It has an economic component, but it also has a political component. Now, that does not mean that in the next day or two, and maybe in 5 minutes, we won't come up with a better term. And if we come up with a better term, I'd be happy to adopt it. But I do think that the Global South does bring something. It brings economics and politics together. And it's imperfect, to be sure, but I don't think we should abandon it necessarily, because it does do some service more than I would say the term the developing world, which is what we used to use. Now, getting to some more substantive points here. Throughout this discussion, we have talked about how China's rise has impacted and affected countries throughout the Global South. We've talked about in different regions and different aspects of China's rise, political, security, and economic, and how those have impacted the Global South. And we have also begun to talk about what we are now beginning, which is the kind of downslope, right? There's a variety of different reasons for this that you know, but most of them are pretty systemic and unlikely to change soon. The Chinese real estate market is unlikely to rebound anytime soon. The Chinese population is unlikely to rebound anytime soon. The disparity between men and women in China is unlikely to resolve itself anytime soon. The problems between the city dwellers and the country folk are unlikely to resolve themselves anytime soon. And this would suggest that in the future, we are going to have a China-Global South relationship where China is not growing nearly as fast economically as it has. And that's going to fundamentally change the way in which the Global South engages. Economics has been at the fore. And when we look at the FOCAC, for instance, we saw for FOCAC meeting after FOCAC meeting, a doubling of Chinese commitments to FOCAC. Well, those days are done, right? In 2021, China had $1 billion of investment in Africa. In 2016, it was somewhere around $21 billion, right? And it's unlikely to return to that anytime soon. And I think that that's the new normal, if you will, that we have to adopt and understand. And we've talked about that throughout the conference. And I think that is really a value add that we have brought here, because I have not heard that discussion taking place to the degree I believe it has to take place if we're to be forward-looking in our understanding. The second thing that I think was brought up throughout the conference is this idea of China's trust deficit in the Global South. And this is fascinating, because you would think that a country like China, which claims itself part of the Global South, who originated the term the Third World, and who has been deeply engaged in the Global South for so long, would have more trust than folks like Emika and others have suggested during this conference that they have. The fact that they have to use other outlets to carry water for them is suggestive that, well, CGTN, Xinhua don't have the kind of credibility that I think they would like to have. And that says something, right? It says something that they've put billions and billions of dollars into this, and at the end of the day are still trying to sneak the messages in through local outlets, because their own outlets are not nearly as credible as, say, the BBC or DW, which is, by the way, one of my favorites. And so this really suggests that China's state-run media and state-run propaganda still has a problem. And I think this came out in a variety of different ways throughout the conference. At the same time, the issue of technology and China's evolving efforts to influence the Global South through that thing in your hand, right? That technology, right? And to influence a new generation of people, young people throughout the Global South in ways that, frankly, I don't see the United States and the West doing nearly as effectively. Third, I think that one thing that came out here is that, for the most part, I did not hear much enthusiasm for the BRICS. And that's interesting because the BRICS is growing, right? They're adding new members. They're holding big events in South Africa. And these members that they're adding are all members of the Global South, big players. You would think that there would be enthusiasm, but there isn't, right? We see Argentina saying, no, thank you. We see Indonesia, no, thank you. And we see the Indians saying, you know what? We're not so sure about a common currency. I mean, frankly, the whole idea of a common currency is somewhat amusing because currencies are very closely tied to the nation they're in, right? You change your policies based on the national conditions. And you know, the national conditions in countries as disparate as Brazil, Iran, and China, it would be hard to imagine how they could coordinate it. Similarly, in the security side, in the Red Sea, it's hard to see how the BRICS is bringing much value added to solving that problem. And we heard about this today. And so it seems to me one thing I learned here is that we should be a little BRICS pessimistic, at least for the time being. And then finally, I think maybe the most important thing is that the U.S.-China rivalry is really at the heart of China's engagement in the Global South. That China sees its engagement with the Global South as part of what it calls the democratization of international relations, what it sees as kind of spreading power throughout the international system, as a kind of Gulliver strategy constrain the United States. And so it sees this, as Nadège Roland explained to us, in a kind of zero-sum manner, where efforts to advance Chinese interests will ipso facto decrease the United States and vice versa. And we also see this reflected in some comments you made here in Washington, D.C. People talking about how the United States has to beat China in the Global South or advantage itself in the Global South. But what's fascinating is when we're hearing from people like Richard earlier today, he was suggesting that no, Chinese concepts of multilateralism are very different than the multilateralism that the South China Sea nations are looking at. Excuse me, the Southeast Asian nations are looking at, right? The multilateralism they see includes countries like Japan and India and a whole variety. I think he mentioned Turkey as well, and the European states. But the idea that it is a bipolar world and the U.S.-China rivalry is a zero-sum game doesn't seem to be as prevalent within Global South nations as it is in Beijing and in Washington, D.C. Interestingly enough, also, as Joseph Asunka's Afrobarometer indicates, we see a strange correlation in Africa between negative views of the U.S. and negative views of China. I mean, it's quite interesting, right? You would think if it's a zero-sum game, then if you go down, then I go up. But in fact, we don't. We pull each other down together. And this is fascinating because it would suggest that rather than a zero-sum game between the U.S. and China, at least in Africa, we're split, perhaps as we are in the U.S., between people who are more global-minded and people who are more nativist. And when we pour scorn upon each other, we put a pox on both of our houses and drag each other down, right? That simply having this negative anti-U.S. drumbeat through Chinese propaganda doesn't actually harm the U.S. to advantage China. In fact, may just harm both of us altogether. And I think this is an interesting juxtaposition between the way we in the U.S. and those in China see this and those nations of the Global South, right? And so I guess the final point I'll make here is that, you know, whether we like it or not, however, our efforts to evolve China into a responsible stakeholder or a more liberal democratic country, both from the European side and the American side, have failed. And in part, that is the kind of backdrop of where we find ourselves today. And so there is going to be, I think, undoubtedly, increasing U.S.-China rivalry within the Global South for the foreseeable future. I don't think that even with a Chinese economy that's on the decline, or that's not rising as fast as it once was, I should say, that's necessarily going to change. But I want to go back to something I said in my opening remarks, which is I do not believe that anything I heard in the last 2 days leads me to change my mind that we are not destined for proxy wars, for the kinds of conflicts we saw in the first Cold War. That the U.S. and China can find a modus vivendi for competition without conflict in the Global South. because I think it would be a terrible thing if we ended up arming different groups and fighting the way the US and the Soviet Union once did. And so maybe that's a positive note. While we will compete with each other, while we will maybe criticize each other, the one thing I think I don't see in the offing is us coming to blows with each other in the global south. And to me, that's actually one of the most important things that we can do, is to find a way to compete without conflict. And I think that that is the kind of thing that, I hope that people in this town and in Beijing keep in mind, because I think that it can be very tempting as you compete more and more to kind of slip into conflict. But I think that we should kind of firewall this, right, to the best degree we can, so that we can compete in a way which does not lead us into the direct conflicts we saw in the first in the first Cold War. And you know what? That may not be possible. Eventually, in places like the South China Sea, as we heard, conflicts may occur. That being said, I think we have to do our best to try to constrain those conflicts and try to maintain, for the sake of the global South and its development, maybe not cooperative, but not directly militarily competitive relationship. And so maybe the final point I want to do is just thank my good friend, Dave Schulman, for all of his efforts to bring this conference together, and all of the great thoughts that he has shared with us here today through his moderation, and to thank you all for coming and spending the last 2 days with us. So let's get a drink.